This Saturday in Big Ten football, we have the number one undefeated 8-0, 5-0 in Big Ten play Oregon Ducks, traveling multiple time zones over from the Pacific time zone to the Eastern time zone, from the Pacific coast to the Midwest, to play in Ann Arbor, Michigan, in the Big House, taking on the 5-3, 3-2 in Big Ten play Michigan Wolverines. Oregon opened up as a 15.5-point favorite, according to Vegas, and the line has moved down a little bit to Oregon minus 14.5 as of today. But Oregon, they are a little more than a two-touchdown favorite over the reigning Big Ten champion, the reigning national champion. Michigan is not winning it all this year. They're not winning the Big Ten, but still something that I don't know how many of you, and I know certainly myself, wouldn't have believed in the preseason that Oregon would be such a massive favorite here. But here we are. This game will be, again, streamed on CBS, Paramount Plus, 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time kickoff, and the Ducks are given a 77.8% chance to win, according to ESPN's Football Power Index. And I got to tell you, if Michigan is going to pull off this upset or make it competitive, they will have to continue what they did against Michigan State, minimizing turnovers, eliminating turnovers, minimizing penalties, playing very disciplined football. But they will also have to do something that they haven't done all season long, and that's put together 4 quarters of good, physical, consistent football on offense, and also 4 quarters of disciplined play and strict coverage and sticking to your assignments on defense. As for Oregon, they can come in, and if they just play a good game, they probably don't even have to play their A-plus game to win convincingly here. What's interesting about this matchup is this is the first time that Oregon has been in the Big House since 2007. This is the furthest out east Oregon has traveled all season long. By the way, the last time that Oregon played in the Big House against Michigan, or played against Michigan in general, they won 39-7 in a blowout win in 2007. That was the game following Michigan versus Appalachian State, where Appalachian State won in that historic 34-32 upset. But they're going to be traveling from basically coast to coast, more accurately one coast to the Midwest. Still a long area to travel. Michigan will have the most talented defense they faced all season long, outside of when they played Ohio State in Eugene. And I think that this will tell us a little bit more about Michigan, specifically Michigan, and also a little bit about the Oregon Ducks here. But they're huge favorites, and Michigan will have to do a lot to win this game. But it's interesting nonetheless. And before I break this game down, I give you my preview and my prediction here. All I want you to do is subscribe to the channel if you may, and also click the notification bell so that you can get notified when we release new content here on College Football with Sam. A lot of you probably watch the channel without realizing you aren't subscribed. So I appreciate your watch hours and your views. I love that, and I appreciate your comments, but please make sure that you are subscribed. And again, click the notification bell, click the like button to help us get into the algorithm, comment your preview and prediction for this game down in the comment section below, and share this channel and video around to other fans you know who love college football, who care about the sport, because consequentially, if they do that, well, they will love this show. We're the best Big Ten football channel on YouTube, and with your help, we can become the best college football channel on YouTube. We just crossed 20,000 subscribers, and I can't wait to look back on this day and say, wow, this was the starting point of it all. Also, join our Discord server via the link in the description or down below in the pinned comment, where you can talk college football with myself and the members of our community 24/7. And if you want to support the channel monetarily, because I know some of you want to do that, you can click the link in the description and purchase a membership on my Patreon page. There's also a link for that in the pinned comment, and it's the same thing for the merchandise store if you want to get maybe this white College Football with Sam t-shirt or an Oregon or Michigan themed College Football with Sam t-shirt. We have Big Ten school themed t-shirts for all 18 Big Ten teams with that College Football with Sam logo, so that you can represent your Big Ten school along with this channel that you and we have built. So thank you very much for doing those things. Again, like, share, subscribe, hit the notification bell, comment, and let's get in here. Let's get in this and dive in. We like to look at the forest and the broad, big picture of things before we dive in to look at the trees and the different aspects of the forest, the different parts of the ecosystem here. Looking at this game broadly, and that's just me saying we'll get into the details and talk about the players in a few minutes, these teams overall are in different tiers. They're in different categories. In the preseason, I thought that Oregon and Michigan would essentially be like this. They would not be the same team in terms of style, of course, but I thought that in a power rating sense, they'd be pretty similar. It was the same thing with Penn State. It was the same thing with Ohio State. They'd all be intertwined and really be only separated by a field goal at most from each other, and sometimes anywhere from less than a point. However, as the season has progressed, you take that same bundle of teams, you subtract Michigan and add Indiana. I think that is the four bundle of teams. Everyone expected there to be either three or more likely four teams in the Big Ten that were all near elite to elite. Well, that's Oregon, Penn State, Ohio State, and Indiana. Michigan has not been that at all this season. They've been very disappointing with the talent that they brought back. They're only viewed as 6.4 points superior to the average college football team per FPI, and only 11.9 points superior to the average college football team in S&P+. Oregon, meanwhile, is viewed as 21 points better than the average college football team, 3 touchdowns exactly superior to the average FBS team, and in S&P+, they're viewed as 26.9 points better than the average college football team. A few weeks ago when they played Ohio State, they were in the upper teens. They've crossed into the lower 20s. This is at least in FPI, but they were also lower in S&P+. Oregon is a team that is trending up. As for Michigan, they've basically been trending down since kickoff against Fresno State. And while a win over rival Michigan State does inspire some confidence amongst the team and fan base, need I remind you, Oregon led Michigan State 31-0 before Michigan State pulled the backdoor cover because Oregon called the dogs off and didn't run up the score. You give Michigan 3 points home field advantage at minimum. I would say typically you could give them 6 or 7, but I don't know how engaged the fan base will be because Michigan already has 3 losses, and even if they were to somehow win out, they would not get a guaranteed seat at the table in the college football playoff because record-wise, there are a lot of strong teams this year. There are going to be several 10-win teams and maybe even an 11-win team that may get left out of the 12-team playoff this year. So having 3 losses already is a death sentence if you want to reach the playoff. And Michigan, again, unless they win out, they have no shot at reaching Indy. None, absolutely. So I don't know how engaged the fan base will be. I would err on the side of Michigan getting more than 3 points in home field advantage. So let's just say anywhere from 3 to 7 points, just because it's the big house, it's 100,000 capacity. Even factoring that in, Oregon would be predicted to win this game really anywhere from 12 to 8 points per FPI. So not exactly covering the spread, but still winning. And when you add in the fact that Michigan's pretty one-dimensional, you probably bump up the predicted score in favor of the Ducks. And when you look at S&P+, well, Oregon would be predicted to win anywhere from 12 to 9 points or 12 to 8 points. So this is just it's a game where clearly one team is better than the other. And while there has been that rule of West Coast teams who travel to the East Coast or East Coast teams who travel to the West Coast have issues, Oregon is they're a way better team than Michigan is, and they're not as one-dimensional. The margin for error when you look at Oregon football is much wider than the margin of error that Michigan has on any given Saturday. Oregon has a points per play margin on average of 0.308. That means for every one of Oregon's play compared to one of every of Oregon's opponent's plays, Oregon scores 0.308 more points. Translation, Oregon on an average basis wins in dominant fashion against all of their opponents. Of course, that's averaging out all of the opponents. That's not looking at specific games where Oregon only beat Ohio State by a point, but nonetheless, they're one of college football's best teams. That's reflected in both points per play margin and also expected points added margin, where they have a 0.247 expected points added margin. Michigan is a 0.033 points per play margin, and they only have a 0.07 expected points added margin. So The Michigan Wolverines, they are not dominant in their wins. They have a few losses. They're not undefeated. They're not even ranked. They continue to fall in power ratings. And, I mean, look, Michigan State outgained them. Michigan State controlled them. They outrushed Michigan, and they controlled the clock. If you applied the same conditions that Michigan State held over Michigan to this game, Oregon would win by 42 points, 35 points maybe, since there are less drives in college football than I and many others are used to, because I think we're all adjusting still a little bit to the 2023 clock rules. But yeah, I mean, Michigan has to do things that it hasn't done really all season long to have a chance to compete in this game and pull off a win. Oregon is the much better team. You see that too in game control, where Oregon is 7th in game control. That means per ESPN, only 6 teams would perform at a higher level than Oregon with Oregon's schedule. Michigan's 40th in game control. And as for strength of schedule, Michigan's faced the 30th best strength of schedule. Oregon's faced the 63rd best strength of schedule. However, Oregon has played Ohio State at home, and the only opponent that Michigan has played who is similar to Ohio State and also similar to Oregon in terms of power rating is Texas. And Texas splattered Michigan in the Big House. So I hope that you can get the picture that I'm presenting to you, that Oregon is the better team. But I've said that now for several minutes, so it's time to get into the matchups and time to get into the details here. I think that the key matchup in this game ultimately is going to be Oregon's defensive line and their linebacker core and their defensive backs against Michigan's rushing offense, which features quarterback, features running back, features the tight ends with blocking, and the offensive line. That's what the critical matchup is here, because I will tell you this: if Michigan struggles to run the ball against Oregon, they are not winning, because Oregon's passing defense is too good. It's too good of a passing defense for what Michigan has to win the game on its own. Against Michigan State, Michigan didn't do that good of a job running the ball. They didn't. But they did a good enough job in the passing game and a good enough job on special teams and defense to where they were able to beat a limited opponent. That's an oversimplified version, of course, but that's how it went. Oregon, again, much, much, much better team. Much better team than Michigan State. So take from that what you will. I think that is the key matchup in this game. Whether Alex Orji, Donovan Edwards, Kalel Mullings, what do they do behind Michigan's offensive line? And how do Jordan Birch, Mateo Uyunglele, and Derek Harmon, former Michigan State defensive tackle, played against Michigan before as one of the best defensive tackles in the country, how do they do in this matchup? How does that game get decided? That matchup get decided? That's what I'm really curious about here. Let's check out Oregon's defense on the season, because they have had a impressive unit. Oregon's defense right now, they are only allowing 15.9 points per game. That's 9th. They are only allowing 0.245 opponent points per play. That's 8th. By comparison, Michigan's outside of the top 30 in both opponent points per game and opponent points per play. Oregon is only allowing opponents to gain 4.8 yards per play. It's 22nd. Michigan's allowing 4.8 as well, but they rounded up there in the teamrankings.com data, so they're 27th, just barely behind Oregon. Oregon allows 308.7 opponent yards per game. That's 15th. Michigan allows 329.8. That's 27th. These defenses are similar in some ways, but Oregon, I think, is better coached. I think Oregon, emphasis on better coached. I do think that Oregon has the much better secondary as well. Michigan leads the Ducks in a lot of rushing defense statistics, but a large part of that's because teams don't run on Michigan all that much. Meanwhile, Michigan's outside the top 100 in opponent passing attempts per game and opponent completions per game. And the only area where Michigan leads Oregon in pass defense is opponent incompletions per game. That's because teams just throw the ball on Michigan so much. And also opponent passing yards percentage. Michigan's 15th there. Actually, And that really just shows how unbalanced Michigan's defense is. That's not a statistic that you want to be too extreme with your lead in, unless you're holding opponents to maybe under 50 rushing yards per game. At that point, maybe it doesn't matter. But Oregon, I think, has the better defense. I think that they have the better offense. As I've said time and time again, they do have the better team. It's just whether or not this Oregon defense, rushing defense to be exact, which is allowing opponents to average 4.2 yards per carry on them. It's 63rd. A lot of that's Ashton Jeanty. Some of it's big runs from Travion Henderson. I think that Oregon may have some problems with stopping big rushing plays, and I know they faced a lot of good running backs, but I think that may be a problem. I don't exactly know, but I'm just intuitively thinking that could be it, but I think overall they still have a pretty good run defense. It's just they faced a lot of good rushing offenses. They allow 134.1 rushing yards per game. It's 49th, 7.1 opponent rushing first downs per game, which is 44th, and they're 26th in opponent rushing attempts per game, only allowing about 32. Compare that to Michigan's rushing offense here. Michigan's rushing offense has just gotten worse and worse and worse every week. Right now, they only average 4.7 yards per carry, which is 48th. They only average 172.8 rushing yards per game, which is 50th. And because they run so few plays, because they're so one-dimensional, and they're not elite at the line of scrimmage, they only average 36.9 rushing attempts per game, which is 47th. The vast majority of their yards come from the ground. They have a 56.97 rushing yards percentage, which is 6th nationally. And almost 60% of their play calls are rushes, are carries for the running back or the quarterback. So this is a team that wants to run the ball in Michigan, and they're not all that successful at doing it, not just because their passing offense has been putrid, but also the offensive line has had some questionable depth. There's a lot of youth there, and the running back room, I think, could be elite. Definitely, I think, is great or near elite, but they're not the best running back room in the country. I think Ohio State's and Penn State's is decisively better in the conference, and I think that Jordan James will be the best running back on the field. Oregon averages 175.9 rushing yards per game. It's 47th, and they average 5 yards per carry, which is 28th, and their rushing offense has gotten better and better as the year has gone on, and also as their offensive line has improved and gotten healthier as the year has gone on. Jordan James right now is 136 carries, 800 rushing yards, and 8 touchdowns on the year. Khalil Mullings is 123 carries, 694 yards, and 7 rushing touchdowns. So those are the two main running backs for these teams here. And I'm curious to see how these two rushing attacks go, how the rushing defenses operate, and whether Michigan will be able to move at all this very stout, strong, disciplined, physical, and athletic Oregon defense. Let's talk about these offenses here for a bit, and then we can talk more about the defenses. So we're going to be talking about players here, and then we'll move on to trench play, special teams, and I'll also give you my prediction. I think Oregon is better at everything compared to Michigan, at every position on offense, outside of tight end, where I think that Colston Loveland, I think that Marlon Klein, and other players in that room, Hogan Hansen, for example, I think they're pretty set there. They have a lot of depth at tight end. They have a starting NFL tight end there, and they also have Max Bredesen, for example. And I'm impressed with this tight end room for Michigan, but that's about where the story ends. That's really where the story ends for this team, because offensively, they have just been, again, putting up bad numbers. They're only averaging 9.1 yards per reception. They're only averaging 5.6 yards per pass attempt. Their best quarterback is Davis Warren, who has 3 touchdown passes, 6 interceptions, a 117.1 passer rating. He's only completing 67% of his throws, which is probably the best stat line out of all of his stat lines, and he only has 567 passing yards. Michigan against Michigan State finally broke 1,000 passing yards, and Michigan has 11 rushing touchdowns and 1,381 rushing yards, averaging 4.7 yards per carry, and Khalil Mullings might's a strong word there, might break 1,000 yards rushing. But this offensive line has allowed 13 sacks on the season, several TFLs. They've had a pass protection problem, and they did a good job protecting against Michigan State, but Michigan State has had a weak pass rush after it looked like they may have a strong pass rush entering this season. And Michigan's also had some issues and rotations at center and also at guard. So this Wolverine squad, I like a lot of the players on offense individually. I do. I like Khalil Mullings, Donovan Edwards, Colston Loveland, the entire offensive line, Miles Hinton, Josh Preeb, Dominic Jadis, Greg Crippen, Giovanni El-Hadi, Evan Link. And I think that, like, Tyler Morris, for example, could be a really good wide receiver, and maybe the same with Samaj Morgan. And there are other players too, like quarterback Davis Warren, Alex Orji, Kendrick Bell. I basically told you the starting offense, or some players that you will see in the rotation. But they are outclassed by Oregon on the offensive side of the football. Oregon has a Heisman caliber quarterback in Dylan Gabriel. They have a Doak Walker Award caliber running back in Jordan James. His backups, Noah Whittington and Jaden Lamar, are some of the better depth running backs in the country, and in the future will be starters, especially with Jaden Lamar. At wide receiver, Justice Lowe, Trayshawn Holden, Jurion Dickey, Evan Stewart, Tez Johnson. They have a deep wide receiver room, and a wide receiver room that features a lot of young talent. They are going to have, I think, moving forward, a kind of an Ohio State-esque system at wide receiver, where old pieces out, new pieces in. It's going to be plug and play at wide receiver. You know, they lost Troy Franklin to the NFL, and I don't think his loss, while it obviously hurts because he's an awesome player, I don't think his loss was the biggest problem for this passing offense earlier in the year when it was having struggles. It was the offensive tackles, the offensive line, really the centered position where Charlie Picard struggled, and Iapani Lulolu's been much better. He was the starter entering the year. He just had some injuries and wasn't fully healthy. And then you look at, like, tight end, Patrick Herbert, Kenyon Sadiq. They're good. It sounds like Terrence Ferguson is injured, but regardless, they have some depth that can step up there. And it was the offensive line and Dylan Gabriel earlier in the year that weren't on the same page, and the O-line wasn't fully healthy. But as the offensive line has gotten healthier, as Gabriel's learned more about this offense, he's done a very good job. The O-line's one of the best in the country, and the wide receiver room and consequently the passing offense is one of the nation's best. You look at the Ducks here, and Oregon right now is 8th in passing yards per attempt, averaging 9.6. Michigan, by comparison, is averaging 5.6 yards per attempt. Oregon, though, is only averaging 12.9 yards per completion, which is 39th. That's because they're completing 74.41% of their passes, which is first in the country, I think, by a country mile. And Dylan Gabriel doesn't throw a lot of deep balls. The only game where they threw a ton of deep passes and were also successful, but really the only game where they threw a ton of deep passes was against Ohio State. That was it. And outside of that, they've pretty much been check down, take what the defense can give us for much of the season. And they had some deep passes. They had one against UCLA, I remember, where it was a nice fake speed option play. I think they had one against Illinois as well, but I can't exactly remember. They're also 5th in average team passer rating. They average a 175.1 passer rating, and they're 8th in incompletions per game, only having 7.7 incompletions per game. And they're 20th in sack percentage. They have a 3.21 sack percentage, which means only on about 3% of their dropbacks, Dylan Gabriel takes a sack. And Dylan Gabriel, 2,371 passing yards, completes 76.2% of his throws, averages 9.4 yards per attempt, 18 touchdowns, 5 interceptions, a 174.8 passer rating. And he hasn't taken a sack from really any team that mattered, like in a competitive game, since Boise State. He took 2 sacks against Purdue, 1 sack against Illinois that was kind of a one-off. The offensive line, ever since that Boise State game, has pretty much been on the money. It's been on point. He occasionally throws a bad interception here and there, and if you're Michigan's defense, that's probably what you want to force, is get some pressure on Gabriel, force him to make a throw that can be turned into a turnover that can be intercepted, to give Michigan some extra possessions, because this offense is going to march up and down the field. It will. It will have success against a Michigan defense that has struggled for much of the season. Tez Johnson and Evan Stewart, Terrence Ferguson, Trayshawn Holden, and Kenyon Sadiq each have over 100 receiving yards, and all of those players except for Terrence Ferguson and Kenyon Sadiq have at least one receiving touchdown. Holden and Stewart have 3. Tez Johnson has 8. You look at Noah Whittington, backup running back, 270 rushing yards, 2 rushing touchdowns, 4.4 yards per carry. And Dylan Gabriel has 5 rushing touchdowns, so 23 total touchdowns for Dylan Gabriel, 5 interceptions. I think he's fumbled a few times here and there, but overall not that much. One of the better quarterbacks in all of the country. For Michigan, their leading receiver is Colston Loveland, 42 receptions, 411 receiving yards, 4 receiving touchdowns, 9.8 yards per reception. He has nearly half of Michigan's receiving yards, exactly half of their receiving touchdowns, and a little over a third of their receptions. He is basically their only weapon in the passing offense, along with some of the other tight ends, and occasionally Samaj Morgan and Tyler Morris, and also occasionally Donovan Edwards. Donovan Edwards, by the way, 415 rushing yards, 3 rushing touchdowns. Kalel Mullings is 694 rushing yards, 5.6 yards per carry, and 7 rushing touchdowns. Let's talk about the defense here now, because for the offense, it's a lot more one-sided toward Oregon. Defensively, you can't make a case, honestly, without sacrificing your integrity that Michigan has a better defense. But you can make the case that Michigan has better players at certain positions individually, and that depending on the effort made and the game plan, that maybe on this given Saturday, Michigan can put up a better defensive effort. But Oregon on the season has the better defense. It's one of the best defenses in the country. Michigan's defense should, based off of talent, be a top 3 defense, if not maybe the nation's best defense, given that Mason Graham, Kenneth Grant, Josiah Stewart, Will Johnson, I mean, 4 Michigan defensive players, 3 on the D-line, are currently projected to be first-rounders. I do think Michigan's D-line, from a standpoint of individuals, less so from a standpoint of the collective unit, but especially from a standpoint of individuals, is better than Oregon's D-line. But it's very close. It's very close because Derek Harmon, Jordan Burch, and Mateo Uyunglele, my apologies, just tried to get through his name fast. They've had really successful seasons. I think it's clear, though, by a wide margin that Oregon has the better linebacker core, and I also think they have the better secondary as well, especially with Will Johnson being injured, and I don't know if he will return, and if he wants to return, I don't know when he will return. The timetable has not been explained to anyone in regards to that injury. Michigan has 21 sacks on the year, 6 interceptions, 35 passes defended, 3 forced fumbles, 3 fumble recoveries. Oregon has 23 sacks on the season. They have 37 passes defended, 6 interceptions, 6 forced fumbles, and 4 fumble recoveries. Their leader in sacks right now is Mateo Uyunglele with 5.5. Jordan Burch has 5. Tioti has 3. Derek Harmon has 3. You look at Michigan, their leader in sacks on the season is Josiah Stewart with 6.5. He also has 2 forced fumbles. Mason Graham is 3.5. TJ Guy is 2.5. Derek Moore and Kenneth Grant have 2. This is a monstrous defensive front for Michigan, where all of Michigan's sacks, all 21 of them except for 2, have came from the defensive line. They're a very, very impressive defensive line. I was looking at PFF grades today, and Penn State and Ohio State have had far superior defenses to Michigan. It's the same thing with Oregon, by the way. But I didn't look at Oregon's Pro Football Focus grades in juxtaposition to Michigan. Actually, I'm going to do that while I tell you this, just because I'm curious. Michigan at D tackle and D end had higher grades for their players than Ohio State and Penn State. In some cases, dramatically higher grades. And yet, because of coaching, Penn State and Ohio State have better defensive coordinators, better defensive assistant coaches, and also having a more balanced roster. They have way better secondaries in terms of depth and also starter upside. And it's the same thing at linebacker compared to Michigan, to where Michigan's essentially wasting their defensive talent. And it's very, very sad. Meanwhile, Oregon's making the most of their defensive talent. This is a defense that I think rightfully so, I did not expect to be a top 5 defense in America entering this year. Just because of some of the performances they had in big games last season, the fact that they were losing talent, they were relying a lot on the transfer portal to make up for their losses in the secondary. You look at interior defenders, though, Derek Harmon's only behind Mason Graham and Rayshon Benny in the Big Ten. He's ahead of Zane Durant, Tyleik Williams, Kenneth Grant, Devon J. Thomas, and then Jamari Caldwell is next, and then he's ahead of Ty Hamilton, Ike Iwuna, Keziah Izzard. Oregon's defensive tackle room is performing at a very, very high level here. And the defensive lines in the Big Ten are some of the best D lines in all of the country. But Oregon, Penn State, and Ohio State have complete defenses. Michigan does not have a complete defense. They have a defensive line that essentially carries the rest of the defense. You look at defensive end, and Jordan Burch and Mateo Uyunglele are behind 3 Michigan defensive ends, 2 Ohio State defensive ends, and 1 Penn State defensive end. And Penn State has a lot of players on this chart. Same with Michigan, because Penn State and Michigan are like really deep at defensive end. Same thing at defensive tackle. Those are the deepest defensive lines in college football. Deeper than Ohio State, deeper than Oregon. But that's really the only area where Michigan has an advantage here, guys, is the defensive line. Mason Graham, Kenneth Grant, Josiah Stewart, Derek Moore, TJ Guy, Rayshon Benny, Ike Iwuna. That is where Michigan's edge is in this game. And they're going up against an Oregon offensive line that has more than enough talent with Josh Connerly Jr., Johnny Cornelius, Marcus Harper, Nishad Strother, and Iapani Lololu to shut them down, to slow them down. That's an edge right there that Michigan would have against a lot of teams, and they had it against Michigan State, for example. But combine Michigan's questionable coaching on defense with Oregon's elite offensive line, I don't know how much the non-negotiable that is Michigan's defensive line is going to matter in this game, especially when Oregon is better at linebacker. They're better at DB. I would take Bryce Betcher and Jeffrey Bassa and Devin Jackson and Justin Jacobs in that linebacker room. I would take that easily over Jayshon Barham, Ernest Hausman, Jimmy Rolder, and Jaden Hood right now. And as for defensive back, Jair Hill, he's been a good player. Will Johnson has, not been his 2023 or even 2022 self, but he's still been very good. Problem is Will Johnson isn't healthy. And Jair Hill, Makari Page, Quentin Johnson, Zeke Berry, Amir Hall, I would not take them, not even close, over Nico Reed, Tysheem Johnson, Kobe Savage, Jabbar Muhammad, and Brandon Johnson. Let's check out some statistics here. We already talked about Michigan and Oregon's rushing defense. Oregon allowing 4.2 opponent yards per carry, Michigan allowing 3.4, but also that Michigan has faced weaker rushing offenses than Oregon has. Oregon playing Travion Henderson, Quinshon Judkins, playing Ashton Jeanty, and Purdue, for all the crap that we all give Purdue often finds ways to kind of get meaningless rushing yards in every game they play in. So I think there's a negative bias statistically against Oregon's rushing defense. But again, you look at passing defense. Michigan's allowing 6.2 opponent yards per pass attempt on average, which is 32nd, 10.4 opponent yards per completion, which is 20th. Oregon's only allowing, and this is factoring in the fact they played Ohio State, 5.8 opponent yards per pass attempt, which is 9th, and 10 opponent yards per completion, which is 11th. You look at third down defense here. Michigan allows opponents to convert on 41.03% of their third downs. It's 80th. Oregon only allows two opponents to convert on 33.7% of their third downs. That's 29th. And on fourth down, Michigan allows opponents to convert for over 50% of their fourth downs. Oregon, it's 40% flat, 22nd. All I am telling you is that Oregon not only has the much better offense, I think that's pretty obvious, they also have the better defense. They are the better overall team here. And I would give them the edge in the trenches. I think they have the slightly worse defensive line, but a much better offensive line. End of conversation. I do think Michigan's better in special teams. Oregon has had some kicking issues that I think would be concerning in a big-time matchup where the game is going to be close. But Michigan's also had some issues on special teams, and I think that Ross James right now is a better punter than Tommy Doman. So the special teams edge for Michigan is it's pretty small. It's there, it exists, but it's small. And I don't think special teams is going to matter a whole lot in this game because Oregon has the much better coaching staff at every angle. They have the better head coach, better offensive coordinator, better defensive coordinator, and they have the better strength and conditioning staff. Their players are deeper. They are stronger. They are more athletic. That's not the case for every individual player, but in large part, that's the case here. They have been better conditioned, better trained, better coached. And consequently, I do think that Oregon covers, and I think that they win. I'm going to go with 31-13, and I think that Michigan, with a little bit of confidence, with a little bit of juice, will probably come out and score a touchdown in the first half, maybe a field goal in the first half too. But I think reality is going to quickly hit, and I think that Oregon will treat this, I think, like a business trip. They'll come out, they'll score on the majority, if not all of their opening drives, and then turn it down after halftime, I think, or at least after the third quarter. After they get up by a certain amount of points, they will turn it down and want to get out of there, waste clock. Maybe Michigan will score these 13 points more so in garbage time than at the beginning of the game, like I think. But regardless, Oregon will cover this 14.5-point spread. They will, winning 31-13 over Michigan. Michigan will fall to 5-4. They will fall to 3-3 in Big Ten Conference play. Oregon will advance to 9-0, 6-0 in Big Ten Conference play, and probably be ranked number 1 after this weekend. Pardon me there. Thank you all so much for watching. Remember to like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and comment your thoughts down below. Thanks to Crash2488, Brasco Rascal, and Counter Little OH for being Heisman members. Thanks to Chris Lane, Ismar, and Tyler Nye for being All-American members. And thanks to John Lynn, Roaming Gnome, Matthew Steele, Austin Christmas, Joshua Jorgensen, Will Loftus for being all-conference members. Make sure to check out my merchandise store, Patreon page, and Discord server via the link in the description or down below in the pinned comment. And also, have a great day, everyone. Go Ducks and go Blue.